Good morning, Borada, Croeso. Lovely to see you coming into this fantastic huddle that we've got here. And what an important huddle you are, and what a great group of panelists that we have, because quite frankly, net zero is something that we're hearing in a phrase almost hourly, aren't we? But, you know, what does it really mean, and what does it mean to us as individuals? Over the next couple of days, we'll be going into some of the detail, but here we're very much setting out the challenges, if you like. And, you know, we hardly need reminding of how important the climate is, the planet is, and our ability to live on it is. You know, we have droughts, don't we? We have floods, we have weather at strange times, we have all kinds of things that are not meant to happen in the way that they're happening now. And without getting into the politics of it too much, you know, the UN is saying that net zero commitments must be backed by action. And we're going to be hearing a lot about individual action, companies' action, and things like that over the next couple of days. And their point is that the action needs to happen for us to have a livable planet. And I think that word livable is something that we really need to think about, because it brings it back to what's going to happen to our planet, our lives, our communities, but also what we can do about it. They also talk about national plans falling short. And of course, in the UK, the committee responsible for climate change delivery, if you like, says that we've been talking, but there hasn't been enough action. So, here, on the first of these panels from these 2 days, we're going to be talking about what this means and action that's already happening. I'd like to introduce my panel. We have John Oates, who's the Acting Deputy Director for Climate Change for the Welsh Government at the far end. Dr. Hushneara Begum, who's founder of Sustineri, and we'll find out more, sitting next to him. Russ Hall, who's sort of net zero high value manufacturing catalyst, long title, but lots of practical examples. And also Raj Kandasamy, who's head of renewable energy vertical markets, which is all getting a bit technical, at Siemens. So hello to you all. Should we give them a big round of welcome and applause? And so, I'm going to coach down here. Gosh, first of all, what do you think net zero means to people, and does it mean anything, do you think, generally, or are we still in a very much a learning phase in terms of that?
With net zero, I think we need to take a step back and understand it's something that's organically come about. It's a term we've coined around just no more than 10 years, and all of a sudden we're assuming that people should understand it. We've obviously got other terms, for example, decarbonisation, nature-based positive responses. We've got carbon neutral, we've got a lot of acronym terms and concepts being thrown around, and net zero is one of many. So now for people to understand what it means may not be that straightforward. I think what we have is a problem where people within circles, perhaps our circle, may understand it, but the wider population might not. And this is where a big disjointment might be happening, and we need to align and bring people together. If we're going to achieve it, we need people outside to understand. But to take a step back, what is it really about? It's about people and places to show that you care. And that's what it's really about. And actually showing, we care about where we live, how we live, and what the future will look for. So I think that's what we need to take it back down to.
And it is quite interesting, isn't it? At all sorts of levels, the phrase net zero has been bandied around. Net zero targets, I'm doing this for a net zero world. And, you know, I was listening to quite a prestigious radio programme, for instance, recently, where they said net zero was when we wouldn't emit any carbon anymore. And it quite clearly isn't that. And if people thought it was that, then that is so impossible to achieve, you'd give up, wouldn't you?
I think putting my academic hat on, when you think about net zero, you have to remember when the first terms come about, there's going to be an organic process with people ironing out what it is and what it isn't. And I think we have the whole concept coming from higher above UN, and then coming through our committees in terms of it. So we need to iron out what it is and what it isn't, and give that message out to people. I think because net zero has been politicalised in some sense, it's thrown around like you have to be in the gang by saying that term. Sometimes people don't know what it is. And when you start questioning people in quite senior positions, it's quite scary what comes out of it.
And just tell us very briefly what it is you do in your work, because it's hard for us to understand what you do.
Okay, I have multiple hats. So I sit as a non-executive director for a government organisation. I'm a lecturer in sustainability and climate change. So I come with that hat. And with Sustineri, we're a sustainability organisation. So we consult with governments and organisations. So I think we're on the forefront of what's happening and hearing all the noise on different sides. I think at times governments do quite a lot of work, but really governments are there to lead in some sense, but we need the public to be behind it and understand. So I think 50, 20 years ago, perhaps we didn't understand what recycling was and the importance of it. We've gone through that journey. We do understand that now. And that's a journey we need to take with net zero as well.
So Russ, I mean, do you think having targets, I mean, you're working in industry with Siemens, do you think having targets and, targets for net zero, is that helpful or not?
I think having net zero as a target is not necessarily the best target. Net zero, the clue is in the net part at the front. So if it's net, we could continue to emit and then we could capture. We could try to capture everything that we're emitting now. But carbon capture as a technology, it's not there yet. It may not be there ever. So surely a better technique would be to reduce our emissions and then capture what's left, giving time for carbon capture technology as an example to catch up. So when we talk to industry at the High Value Manufacturing Catapult, what we do is we give a message of efficiency first, because emissions fundamentally related to energy. If you bring it back to its basics, you use less material, you use less energy. Energy efficiency, less emissions. It's pretty, like in my head, but I get to live in it. Obviously, it's quite straightforward.
But also there's the whole notion of circularity, isn't there? Where obviously you try and reduce less, but you also try and waste less, or use that waste in another way, or give it to someone else to use.
But it all comes back to the same thing. So if you, I will fold circular. I need to just tell the story, and I'll fold it in, because otherwise
you tell the story.
So if you do energy efficiency first, and then move to electrifying processes, and then move to low carbon gas processes, then move to capture, what you've got is a lovely process that allows you to sort of follow energy as the key to get there. And where does circularity fit? Circularity fits because it's about energy consumption. So if you're using less material, so you're using it in a more clever way, right? Or you're using recycled material, or you're recycling material, all the hard work of the energy consumption has been done at the front. Now, just down the road from here, where I used to work, or a company I used to work for, was Tata Steel.
Yeah.
At Tata Steel, there is a blast furnace. It makes steel by burning coal as a part of a chemical reaction process to reduce iron ore to make iron. When you recycle steel, what you do, all that hard chemical work has been done up front, and you melt the steel down. It still requires a huge energy input, but that chemical reaction, that heavy chemical reaction with the heavy emissions, that work has already been done. That's why circular economy works, because it's about energy consumption. It takes it away, and therefore there's less emissions. Yeah. It's all about energy efficiency.
And it's about reusing the carbon in a way that was used in an earlier stage, isn't it? If a car is crushed down, you're reusing the carbon from when it was first made to make the next product.
In a way, yes, that carbon is locked into that process, and it should not get re-emitted.
Now, you, quickly before we move on to Raj, I mean, your members in your catapult are, some of the big users, the big carbon emitters, the big users. They are very much in the front, they're ahead of this game in a way, aren't they? Because they've had to be.
Some are and some aren't. It isn't a straightforward, I wish it was a straightforward answer and I can say, yes, these companies are leading the way. Some are really good, and some know what they're doing. Some really don't. But there is a huge, as was spoken about before, there is a huge problem with understanding what terms mean and understanding carbon literacy. So I was sat in a manufacturing forum 3 weeks ago, and one of the first questions that was asked was, Russ, can you explain what net zero means? So I explained it. Then we get onto the definition of what do emission scopes mean? So I spend my life talking about emission scopes.
by emission scopes, we mean the various stages, where it's tier 1, tier 2, tier 3.
So the scope 1...
Can you explain that in
Sure.
simple terms?
So scope 1 is direct emissions. And a great example of a direct emission that we all have is we all breathe out CO2. That is the best example of a direct emission, of a scope 1 emission. Scope 2 are the emissions associated with your purchased energy. So we all buy energy, we just do, there's nothing we can do about it. The way that energy is generated has CO2, greenhouse gas emissions associated with it. And then there's scope 3. And scope 3 is the elephant in the room.
That's the really tricky one.
It's the really tricky one. A great way of describing scope 3 emissions is consumption emissions. So it's the emissions that are associated with the consumption of products. So we've all got one of these, right? It's a mobile phone. And your scope 2 emissions are associated with charging it, but your scope 3 emissions of making that phone outweigh that 1,000 times over. Because to do that, we have to create material, we have to put things together, and they have to come through these massive, great, complex supply chains. And then it gets used, and we have upstream, which is your supply chain, and downstream, which is your usage scope 3 emissions. And they're really difficult and complicated, but we can't ignore them because they're bigger than everything else.
Now, in fact, in the next session here, in an hour's time, we'll be talking about how you calculate carbon and how you can offset it for good, if you like. So we're going into some of the impacts of things you can do about your scope 3 later on. Raj, Siemens, we think of Siemens as making wind turbines and doing all sorts of stuff like that, but Siemens internally as well has been doing a lot, hasn't it, this year?
Absolutely. So earlier this year, Siemens announced that one of the manufacturing facilities, first UK manufacturing facility, fully carbon neutral, and how we went about doing that. It's going back many I was going to say many years ago. Before, sorry. So I'm
very
not
noisy out there. Sorry about this.
I'm also not the loudest talker here. So in 2015, Siemens pledged to be carbon neutral, to be net zero by 2030, and that was before any government or any other major organizations decided to take on. But I was saying earlier, earlier this year, we had one of the, out of 19 manufacturing facilities, we had the first manufacturing facility to be carbon neutral, and we achieved that.
Was that very difficult to achieve?
It was quite challenging, and when we announced in 2015 to be carbon neutral by 2030, straight away we went into work in 2016. We started procuring green energy for all our facilities. So straight away.
That's the tier 2.
That's the tier 2. Over us, exactly.
What about your tier 3s?
Tier 3 is going to be quite challenging, and we have, being an engineering company, we have developed tools and softwares and technologies that to work with tier 3 in terms of, you talked about calculating the carbons and working with your suppliers and customers to sort of understand how much carbon you're emitting and how much carbon you're consuming from supply chain.
So did you get your suppliers to change their behaviour to satisfy you?
Well, exactly. So because of that, we are having to then force our suppliers to sort of, to become carbon neutral. And we as a company, our customers are also asking us to be that. So we have the technology in terms of software tools to kind of adopt that, and we get asked daily from our suppliers, how could you help to do that? And I think the answer is, it's not just how Siemens does it. I mean, we have to work collectively with our suppliers, with our customers, and it's not just one person doing it or one company doing it. We've got to work collectively to achieve that.
I'll be throwing this out to all of you to ask questions very soon. But I personally, I don't know about you guys, I personally think one of the most exciting things is how this will cascade through suppliers, because basically customers and brands will depend on your supply chain. But of course, John, it's about much more than product, isn't it? It's about people as well, and a just transition, and the way that we change society. And that's something you're really focused on, isn't it?
Yeah, Welsh Government in general is...
Welsh Government in general is very focused on... It seems an interesting thing to say in a tech place, but we don't believe that technology will save the day. It has a hugely important role to play. It has a role to play in data. It has a role to play in providing new solutions, etc. But I think the initial conversation about do people understand net zero, I'm a bit in two minds really about whether people need to understand net zero. Actually, from my own personal life, I know that there's embedded carbon in my car. I know that when I put petrol or diesel in it, I know that there's more carbon up into the air. I know that when I buy fish fingers, there's embedded carbon in those fish fingers as well. But I can't tell you how many grams of carbon are in my fish fingers, and I can't tell you how many tons of carbon are embedded in my car. And yet, I'm quite heavily involved in net zero. I think the human nature, the human aspect of it is that we're all going to have to get used to a slightly different world to the one that we live in now in 2050. And that will require us to make some changes to the way that we live our lives. Now, what we do believe in Welsh Government is that people are generally quite motivated to make the, inverted commas, right choice. So we've gone from Hush mentioned recycling. 20 years ago, Wales was nowhere on recycling, and now we're domestic recycling or municipal recycling. We're third in the world, which is a pretty substantial change. And all that's required is ultimately Welsh Government to provide quite a lot of money to local government and to ask something of the public. And the public, by and large, has responded to that. But what we need to do that is ramp that up in different parts of the economy and make it, this is policy-based, this isn't comms-based, this isn't, there is comms associated with it. But if I ask you to do something different, if government asks you to do something differently, the vast majority of the public will largely ignore. But if we can create the policy also that enables the right choice, the easier choice for you to make, then you might be more inclined to make that change. And in doing so, if we can do that in a way that actually recognises that we're not all the same and we don't necessarily have all the same resources and we don't necessarily have all the same opportunities, we suspect that, well, we know that there's an opportunity to unlock some changes that will perhaps make it a more equitable nation to live in.
How, in this particular thing, how do you think we can best engage people so they don't see just net zero as them losing their jobs and not being able to fly on holiday? Because it's a conversation.
I do get lots of ministers get lots and lots of letters about things like that. There's quite a lot of nonsense out there in the outside world, and we were discussing earlier about a personal observation that out of certain media outlets in the last 6 to 9 months, I've seen a massive uplift in the number of stories about EVs not working, about heat pumps not working, about 15-minute cities preventing people from leaving their homes upon pain of death, etc. So we currently have live campaigns, and we reach out with communities to try and engage them on not net zero, but on the changes that they can make, on what is coming down the track, and preparing for the kind of changes that might come down the track. But as I say, the comms side of that, and that has to be two-way comms, that's not just broadcast. The two-way comms of that is really important, but not as important as engaging people on the policies that will need to be in place to affect the change that we want to affect, and we think we need to affect.
Okay. Anyone like to put forward a question? Anyone want to say anything? I'm quite happy to carry on, but it's your show as well. No? Right. Okay. So, oh yes, brilliant. Hang on, there's a mic coming.
Hi. Phil Clements from the High Value Manufacturing Catapult. Do you think more needs to be done to encourage businesses in supply chains to work together to solve these problems rather than letting individual companies tackle it on their own? Strikes me there's a lot of overlap between solutions and we could be far more effective in solving problems like that.
Yeah.
Absolutely, I completely agree. I mean, we've experienced that, trying to sort of decarbonize and trying to offset that. Like I said earlier, it's not one company trying to do this. We have to do work with our suppliers and also with our customers as well. I don't know if that answers your question, but no, thank you.
I'm someone obviously that does agree with that as well. I think it's not that easy working with procurement and supply chain management. So when you start looking at it, you're actually looking at production that potentially goes across globes, countries, language barriers, and you're now expecting to carry the word net zero, potentially, for example, into Bangladesh, into a factory, which may not be on par with the conversation here. I think this is where we need to translate it and pass over the supply chain, which is far more complex than we could imagine.
Russ, and then Rajan's come back as well.
So I think that if we can, I'm going to use Boeing 787 as an example. So Boeing 787 has 2.3 million components sourced from 13 regions of the world, with some parts, the same part, coming from 5 different countries. Each of those parts and each of those components has its own carbon footprint. Just to build on the 2 points that are made and to answer your question, Phil, yes, supply chains need to work harder, and yes, supply chains need to be better integrated to make this happen. But I'd even go as far as saying that for the big OEMs and tier ones, it's actually a little bit unfair of them to ask some of the small suppliers in their supply chains to decarbonize in that way, and they should be helping them. It's not about translating necessarily the word net zero as much as translating, I want you to do something and I will tell you or ask you or show you or help you on that journey.
And what's the best way of them helping those smaller companies? Is it financial? Is it advice? Is it walking alongside them?
It's all of the above. There is no one answer. So for one company, it might be that they need investment to buy a new kit, and it might be that they need help to just have that investment because they know how to decarbonize. But for some of the smaller companies that we come across, actually, it's an understanding. So give them education, show them give them carbon literacy. They don't have to achieve net zero for every component. They don't have to be carbon neutral for every component. But what they do have to do is achieve lowest possible emissions associated with what that target's trying to do. And let's not forget as well, smaller manufacturers in particular are sector agnostic. So Boeing might be buying from, my friend Mike owns a stamping company in the West Midlands. That stamping company provides hinges, parts to the NHS, to aerospace, to automotive, different targets for different times. Basic carbon literacy, basic knowledge of what things mean will solve things for all sectors at once.
Raj wants to come in as well.
I was going to say, actually, I work for a large organization and it's not fair. I mean, some of our suppliers are, medium-sized to small companies, and it's not fair to sort of impose pressure on them to sort of to make the Siemens brand look good. It's not fair, and Siemens is very clear on that. And part of the net zero strategy is also we have 6 key priorities. And one of them is sustainability and working closely with your partners and employability and ethics and governance and so on and so forth. So exactly what Russ mentioned there, it's not, and also to Phil's point, it's not just one company doing it. I think you've got to work quite collectively. And my last point is, other companies, the senior leaderships within the companies must also have this kind of vision about doing it, and rather than kind of holding back and not sure, not knowing what to do, and companies like us could help them. Yeah.
Thank you. And in terms of the public sector, or basically citizens' lives, if you like, John, I think you could argue that there's a similar approach, that if we just think the government's going to do it, the government may be like a big company, then that's very different from if we can be told that just, if we walk somewhere, we're helping the air in our community. Perhaps we need to bring it down to little things that we can all do to stop it being something that we see as too big to do anything.
Yeah, again, I think I'm a little bit conflicted here, because sometimes the narrative is, if we all just do a little bit, we'll solve the problem.
That's not
that might not be the case, actually. We might need to do quite a lot in a lot of different places. The public sector has a key role to play. The public sector in Wales spends about £6 billion a year on procuring goods and services. About 4 billion of that stays within Wales through the original purchasing. Clearly, through our procurement exercises across the public sector, we can start to influence the supply chain. And so one of the key things that we did the then minister did in 2017 was set the ambition, not a target, an ambition for the public sector to try and get to net zero by 2030.
Is there any chance at doing that?
It's pretty spicy.
I won't push you anymore.
Well, I think the UK government has committed for the power sector to be net zero by 2035, which would suggest that the public sector in Wales needs to go ahead of that by 5 years. I think some of the work we're trying to do at the moment is trying to understand, well, what would that actually mean? Is that going to cost £100 billion? Because if it is, that's probably not going to happen. If it's going to cost 50p, then maybe that would happen. So there's quite a lot of work happening there. But the public sector only really has three levers. It has money, and not a lot of that anymore, actually. It has influence, and it has regulation. So those are the three levers that we can pull. But in many respects, certainly in Wales, there's limitations with all of those things. It does require individuals to act. It does require every company to act. And that's why certainly our Net Zero Wales approach has been more of a Team Wales approach. It's not been, we've deliberately not tried to give the impression of a top-down diktat. Government is going to do this, because government can't do this. Government can set the conditions that can enable others to act, but it can't do it.
Any more questions? Yeah, question over here.
Hello? Oh, sorry. In terms of, Jonathan, thank you for that. In terms of influencing and the Paris Agreement being in place, when do you see taxation being a part of influencing companies to act?
Taxation is already part of the system. So one of the areas of responsibility I have is the Welsh Government's interest in the UK emissions trading scheme. So that is not actually a taxation system, but it applies a carbon price to the biggest emitters in the UK. We used to be part of the EU emissions trading scheme, but Brexit gave us the gift of the UK emissions trading scheme. And essentially that applies a price, it's a market-based price, to every tonne of carbon that's emitted by heavy industry, fossil fuel power generators and aviation. And for Wales, because we're still quite an industrialised nation, that's 45% of our emissions are covered by a carbon price. Across the UK, it's only about 25%. But I think as we move forward, that's 75% of the UK economy not covered by a carbon price. The whole point of a carbon price is to give an incentive, a financial incentive or nudge for somebody, for an organisation to move, and it also helps to crowd in investment. I think those are key elements of a carbon taxation system. If you are going to punish companies or individuals for a certain behaviour, you've got to be very clear that that's going to have the desired effect and not an unintended effect. We can quite happily reduce our territorial emissions dramatically by completely offshoring all of our industry and power generation. Not a problem. That's not that's not a good transition. That's not going to provide the leadership to other nations across the world that actually you can do so whilst creating a stronger, more sustainable, environmentally sustainable and economically sustainable, i.e., might be still here in 30 years' time. We're not going to provide that leadership to other nations on the planet, and we do have a leadership role. Let's be clear about this. I go to the odd conference of parties. I'm going to Dubai in a few weeks' time. Wales is a world leader here. Now that's encouraging and depressing in equal measure, because I know how much work we've got to do still in Wales, but we are influencing other nations.
And one of the things I'm interested in you saying that is, under the Future Generations Act, aren't we meant to be a globally responsible Wales? So we shouldn't just offshore our emissions, or is that actually a tricky one?
Well, the Wellbeing for Future Generations Act covers around about 50 public sector bodies legally. Lots of other organisations essentially voluntarily operate with that kind of mindset. So the Wellbeing for Future Generations Act essentially, in a nutshell, asks us to consider the needs of future generations and the rest of the planet in the decisions that the public sector takes. So we can't legally, we cannot make decisions that help the current generations by sacrificing future generations. We're not allowed to do that. And part of it was to try and get away from these 5-year political cycles and actually genuinely thinking long term rather than just what happens at the ballot box next time. And we were the first nation to have that kind of legislation, and we have conversations, not me particularly, colleagues have conversations with other nations on a regular basis about how they're going to implement something similar.
Russ, you wanted to come in on this?
Taxation for prevention of climate change is firstly real and now, as John's just said, and there is more legislation coming down the track that will affect manufacturers in the UK. 2 weeks ago, the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, entered its trial phase, and that will affect anyone who's exporting iron, steel and aluminium into Europe. By 2026, they will have to declare the emissions associated with it. By 2025. In 2026, the UK equivalent of the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism will come into force, or should come into force. I was lucky/unlucky enough to be at the first meetings for that at the House of Lords when they were talking about it. The UK is probably going to do it a different way, not necessarily follow suit in the way it accounts for its emissions compared to the EU. That legislation is remarkably opaque at the moment. It's quite hard to see your way through and know exactly what it applies to. But it will affect UK manufacturers, and there is a high chance it could be damaging to UK industry.
Can you explain how it will affect manufacturers?
Sure. So if the idea of a carbon border adjustment mechanism is to prevent a thing called carbon leakage. So in effect, if you're buying aluminium from a high emitting country, that will be taxed more than one that's charged from a low emitting country. So if you're buying aluminium from Turkey, which has a coal grid, or if you're buying it from Scandinavia, which is a hydroelectric grid, then there's an obvious difference in the carbon intensity of the aluminium that's being produced. Is it a fair way of doing it? It's a more fair way of doing it than some things, yes, and in other ways, no, because what it assumes is that we'll just switch our aluminium supply from one place to another. But it doesn't work like that. That's not how the metals industry works. You've got to know you can buy the right product from the right plant in the right place in order to fulfill whatever it is you're trying to make. The further complication then is that the UK has its own carbon border adjustment mechanism and the EU has one. Well, what about products that are started in the UK, move to the EU for finishing, come back into the UK, and then perhaps get sold in the EU? So that could be taxed 4 times.
And of course that happens a lot, doesn't it?
And that happens a lot.
To be in the same market.
Now, added to that, because we've got carbon border adjustment mechanisms, but we've also got EU legislation coming down the track, which is DCRS, SCRS. That is coming down, that's actually being written by finance firms, and it will affect manufacturing. That's going to get down to a granularity of 750 employees per company, and that will also be live by 2026. Now, 750 employees still a lot of employees, but actually we're starting to get into mid-cap size, and the impact that could have on UK manufacturing starts to become more and more and more. And so I'm by no means an expert in this, but I am aware it's coming. But I'm just wondering how many manufacturers in the UK are even aware of carbon border adjustment mechanisms to start with, and then all of the other legislation that's coming along as well. It's an ever-changing landscape, and please, just be aware of it, or come and ask if you're not, and we'll try and help.
Yeah. Any more questions, or should we delve further into this? Any more questions? No. Okay. So how can people? Perhaps this is what we do actually. How can those smaller suppliers keep abreast of all these changes? Because if they don't, they're going to be dropped. Because if I'm a big manufacturer, I'm going to choose the cleanest, to use very tabloid language, the cleanest supplier. I might dump that one there, but they're not as clean. So how do we do this?
I think it works two ways. I think the power dynamic, obviously, from a larger organisation with smaller actual SME potentially, you have to understand there's always going to be a power dynamic. We're assuming that the small supplier will have a lot of control and say. They may be part of membership organisations, for example, FSB, CBI. They might be able to connect that way. And there are conversations that are they're having these conversations internally within member organisations. But I think also connecting back into government, feeding back how they're feeling certain things. I think, for example, for Industry Wales, our board, we're very aware of what's happening. We're aware when it comes to the SMEs, that's a big part of the population in terms of industry within Wales. And I think at times that they don't tap into enough funding to start off with. They're not close enough, but I think it's a two-way process.
But it could be a real opportunity for those companies, because they could say, look, I've changed more than him, so give me the contract.
I think it is a game changer. So I do consulting for example, PepsiCo. They have farmers around the country. They're across different borders and everything. Once they start talking to certain sectors, they go, actually, the answer of what we need isn't always with big organisations. It could be with innovators, with SMEs coming through. They're quicker, they're more agile, they may be closer to the problem. So actually, it's a great opportunity overall. It's the way you look at it long term.
Raj, is that something that you've experienced with Siemens, is that actually you had coming forth new suppliers, dynamic suppliers who perhaps you hadn't had before? I mean, has it changed your supply chain, or have you brought your supply chain up to speed?
I think it's a mix of both, and the company's motto is to work and help companies who are struggling to get up to speed. So rather than work with companies who are clean and, as you say, want to get in front of you, the policy is to look at, if there's a company that is struggling to be carbon neutral or to become net zero, is to help them, whether that's through financially or through tech, and that's what we've done.
So you've kind of partnered.
Yeah, it's a big, as I said before, it's more of a partnership rather than single-handedly choosing one over the other. Most of our suppliers that we work with have been long-term suppliers. So, our philosophy and the drive is to help companies that want to work with us. Yeah.
So I'm going to shamelessly quote Joe Biden.
Gonna what?
Shamelessly quote Joe Biden. When I see green, I see jobs, jobs, jobs. The UK was once, and I firmly believe can be, the scalpel blade of the world in terms of manufacturing, engineering, and science. And the green transition really is the route to do it. We have all of the capability in the UK to recycle materials, to lead the world in how you do that, and to be green in the process of doing it. It's a huge part of my job. It's actually pretty much what gets me out of bed every morning. But when you think about the opportunity that's there, it's enormous.
Okay, but there's a big challenge, John, in the narrative, isn't there? Because the narrative is not that. It's a general conversation in Wales. It's like steel jobs going rather than look at whole new industry changing. and it's not as simple as steel jobs going and things like that, is it?
Yeah, I mean, I was a bit depressed about the announcement that was made at Tata the other week, because the narrative was hijacked by this kind of thing that, well, we're going green, so there's jobs going, and that is not the case. Our chief economist will quote how many jobs a week are created in Wales and lost in Wales, and it's quite a lot every week. I think it's 1,000, but don't quote me on that. The economy will change, and I think the panel colleagues have accurately, from my perspective, characterised the opportunity there. I don't believe that any sizable company will be able to sell high carbon products anywhere in the Western world in 20 years' time. And there are competitive advantages of being a first mover there. So I think I see, and it's not just envisioning, I think we see evidence of growth. You know, the UK economy in general has been decoupled from fossil fuel burning over the last 20 years. And we see other nations doing exactly the same. So there is a significant growth opportunity. We have fantastic companies in the UK and in Wales. We have brilliant academic institutions. We struggle in some areas with investment, and there are a whole bunch of reasons for that. And we struggle on productivity, and there are a whole bunch of reasons for that. And I'll not go into those because I'm not qualified to go into them. And I do get concerned about certain narratives that seem to continue to pervade, that is, we keep the status quo because that's going to be good for us. A high carbon economy in 2050 will not be good for the UK. That will be disastrous for the UK. The benefits of going early are pretty substantial, I think, and that's certainly what Welsh Government is pushing for.
And there are huge opportunities, aren't there, to be had?
Huge employment opportunities. Not all jobs will stay the same because they never do. The only thing that never changes is that there is always change. That doesn't mean to say people shouldn't be fearful, because that's an entirely human reaction. But a lot of the work that we're trying to do, and we'll be publishing a consultation hopefully before the end of the year on just transition, about a framework that we're hoping to publish, is about how we get a more coherent and consistent planning across Wales for the changes that are going to come. Because if we can identify the changes that are likely to occur, we can collectively, Welsh Government, local authorities, learning establishments can help prepare the workforce for the economy of the future. So there is a big opportunity, but there are risks with that, and we should be concerned about some of those risks, but massive opportunities if we get it right.
And Hush is going to have the final word to lead us into the future.
Okay, as I was listening to John, one thing that came to mind, this month is obviously quite a special month in terms of our journey in the UK. So I'm going back, and hopefully I've got the right date. 30th October 2006 was the release of the Stern Review. And that was a government commission piece. And what came out of it was a huge document and a summary document, but overall it was the narrative of longer we leave it, harder it's going to get. And from that, we had the Climate Change Act and everything that came after. I think we're now here, October, another decade, moving forward, but the longer we leave it, the harder it's going to get. It's better to be at the front, muddy through the waters, and be at the forefront of the brighter tomorrow. I think that's the final thing that I'd like to leave with.
Well, Hush, thank you very much. A really nice last point to put with us, and thank you very much. Thank you, audience, and thank you, panelists. John, Hush, Russ and Raj, thank you very much. And our next session will be about how do you calculate carbon usage and how do you offset that in a meaningful and good way. Thank you very much.